Storytelling and micro stories, which was the original title of this talk before everyone was like, it's too long. Pretty much all of you know me. My name's Kendall. Hi, nice to meet you. And I run the writers meetup here every other Monday, so pretty much got into gaming wanting to do story design for games. So starting off, what is environmental storytelling? Environmental storytelling is generally used the best when it is used to communicate what has happened in the past, or to show pretty much the final outcome of something that has happened before you, the player, has entered the game world. So, something like Fallout does this extremely well because it's based on an entire civilization that went through an apocalypse before the events of the game. Pretty much what it does is it allows the player to, come up on a scene and figure out, oh, X must have happened here, or maybe it was Y that happened here. Looking at whatever is placed in front of you, you can draw your own conclusions. So, probably somewhere someone is walking around with a bunch of printer ink all over them. There are a ton of examples. Usually environments in games are full of little micro details that are placed very intentionally to give the player more of a sense of their surroundings, reinforce the general story of the game, the themes. This is a great picture from BioShock, and it just really brings together this whole idea of Rapture is supposed to be this utopia. They're celebrating this party and things going horribly, horribly wrong. Environmental storytelling doesn't have to be huge. It can be as simple as finding somebody somewhere in the apocalyptic world, wasteland, putting a teddy bear with a newspaper and some glasses on the toilet and just having fun. Or it can be, reinforcing, again, as I said, like the themes in the game that you're playing. So again, another BioShock screenshot, above all, do no harm. Again, this is just something that you can stumble across, but it, really adds to the whole theme of being in a city with no ethical code and where morals have sort of gone wrong. So micro stories. Micro stories are generally text-based, whereas environmental storytelling is usually visual-based. Basically tells more information on setting or characters. A lot of the times you'll find little micro stories about the NPCs that you meet in your game worlds. And it can be anything. It can be, a lot of the times you'll find like diary entries, or this is a screenshot from Gone Home, which, is just like this little bit of paper that the characters in the game had written on before you arrived. So, it can show a lot of personality, add more details to people's lives. It doesn't have to be in the past, per se. It can also tell you information about like future events, current events, things like that. Can be more specific just by, what am I trying to say, by virtue of generally being text-based. You're not walking into a scene and trying to piece it together from what you can see and drawing your own conclusions. A lot of the time, you can get a lot more specific information about, the characters of the world with micro-stories. So here's another example again from Gone Home. This one, it's, again, it doesn't like tell a huge story, but it does say that, somebody in this world went to see Pulp Fiction. It gives you the dates, the name of the theater. And one of my favorite things about this is like the little card at the end says a tradition of excellence since 1933, and it just adds this sense of like, this theater that they went to really has been around for a while. It's like a permanent thing in this world. Like you're not just stumbling on stuff that doesn't really, have any place in what you're playing. So what's the difference between environmental storytelling and micro stories? I sort of touched on this a bit. Environmental storytelling tends to be more visual. Micro stories tend to be more text-based, but obviously there are tons of examples where you can do environmental storytelling through text. Generally this is seen a lot with, what am I trying to say, text adventures. Or you can do micro stories through like an audio file or, you know, a bunch of other different avenues that you can take for that. Environmental storytelling, I mentioned this already as well, but it works the best when it's telling the player about the past, and micro stories really don't need to live on past events in the same way. So examples, you know, I've mentioned all of these games a couple of times, but you know, the vaults in Fallout, those are a plethora of micro stories that just add layers to the game world. You know, if anyone has ever played Fallout, you know that all of the vaults have like sinister experiments behind them, or like just weird things going on. Gone Home is a game that's based entirely on walking around a house and finding things and putting together like the pieces to figure out like what happened before you arrived home. Portal is a great example. I'm going to show more about that on the next slide. But as I said, like any kind of game built on the framework of like an apocalypse or the remains of past civilization works really well, especially for environmental storytelling, because there's so much you can say about what came before. Games with lots of NPCs are really great, especially for micro storytelling, so that you can add more details to some of the people you meet that you may not get just from talking to them. So one of the games that I'm working on right now, it's another text adventure, and you're on a spaceship, and there's you can like talk to the captain of the ship, and he's sort of very like standoffish and, you know, doesn't say a lot. But at one point, if you're exploring his room trying to find something, you can you find like a little box next to his bed, and if you pick it up, it says, you know, the box rattles, and if you open it, you find a wedding ring and a well-read note, and it doesn't, you know, it doesn't say what the note says. It doesn't give you any information beyond that, and you can't even talk to the captain about it, but it gives the player like this little added piece to his personality. So, you know, you can do a lot of fun things depending on that. One of my favorite examples of storytelling is Portal. You know, Portal was a very small, like, compact game, but with the added layer of this story of the Rat Man that you never, you know, no one ever sits down and is like, well, here's what happened from A to Z. You know, you just find all of these little places and, you know, his ramblings and, you know, et cetera, et cetera. And you can absolutely play Portal and not explore any of those, and like maybe you'll catch like a glimpse here and there, and you know, you've played a good game. But then if you really do like dive into trying to investigate like the history of the Rat Man, it becomes this very, very interesting experience, far beyond what you would have had otherwise. And another Fallout screenshot. Fallout loves their skeletons. So doing it badly. One of my personal pet peeves with environmental storytelling, micro stories, this is more of a micro story, is you know, the Dear Diary format. You know, our example up here is somebody ripping on Bethesda for having a lot of like Dear Diary things where it basically is like, hey, player, wink, wink, nudge, nudge, there's treasure over here, you should go check it out. Like, man, sure hope nobody shoots me, you know, and then you inevitably find like the dead skeleton with the note. And that always, it sort of rubbed me as being lazy. You know, there's so many more things you can do, and it never felt like it was really coming from the actual voice of a character. It just very much felt like a, you know, psst, player, look over here. Like, it always just broke the fourth wall for me. So, you know, that's one of my least favorite things when I see like somebody doing diaries. They can be done right, but if you really take care to like try to speak through the voice of the character who wrote the note. But yeah, so anything that breaks the immersion of the game, you know, when you're trying to add depth to your game world, the last thing you want to do is launch your player out of it. So if you're sitting down and you're starting to create a game, and you're trying to think of like, you know, how do I add more detail here? Where should I show more things? Where should I not show more things? Some good things to think about, you know, what you're planning on adding to the game, be it environmental or like a story. What does it add to the game? You know, is it informative of the overall setting? You know, as I said, does it add like another layer to an NPC? Or is it just kind of like a detail and it doesn't really mean anything? And you know, sometimes those are okay, but then it's more fun for the player to go around and find interesting things and draw their own conclusions. You know, thinking about what you want the player to know about the world is really important. Generally, writers, and this goes for game designers as well, know so much more about the world and their characters and everything that the player is going to experience than what is in the final project. And you can take little bits and pieces of that and decide to add it in, you know, just as like this little bit of icing on the cake. You know, maybe you don't have a whole side quest around like this one NPC's like backstory, but you know, maybe you can find like something in the game that shows it to you, or you can see like you know, something in the game world that someone has mentioned, and then you can go visit a place and actually see it for yourself. So you know, those kind of little details. And then, you know, not doing too many cliches. I mentioned Fallout and their skeletons. You know, I get it, it's a post-apocalyptic world, everybody's dying, but there is such thing as too many skeletons. Like, do it in a fun, unique way, you know, add something interesting into it if you're going to do something that you think has been done a few times. You know, so when you're thinking of what you want to add in, as I said, starting off points, the example that I gave with the NPC in my text adventure, you know, I just sort of was fascinated by him as a character, and I really wanted to add in, you know, pieces that would let you know more about him, since you don't really interact with him that much. There's another part in my game which is actually disguised as a rather innocuous detail, but it is actually like a clue to unlocking the rest of the game. You go digging through, what am I trying to say, a desk drawer, and you find like Smarties wrappers and like electrical tape, and you're like, okay, this is interesting, you know, it's a little fun detail about this person is like maybe kind of messy and they like Smarties and, you know, they have electrical tape here, whatever, okay, interesting, moving on. But then like later in the story, you actually have to like unlock their terminal, and the prompt is like, what's their favorite candy? So, you know, adding in like those little details can also, you know, be a fun part of the game, while also like adding another layer to a person. You know, even stuff like, you know, in this world, story that you're telling. But mostly just thinking about, what do you know that your player doesn't and won't from just the main story or main actions of the game, and what is like the best way to tell that to them. So in that, you know, thinking of what you're trying to say to the person, or to the player rather, and what is the best way to say it. And this goes back to, you know, the difference between environmental storytelling and microstories, where you know, if you're trying to express something about the history of the world or an event that's happened, maybe environmental storytelling is the better way to go, since it works so well with showing past events. Or if you're you know, trying to say something more about the present, or you really for some reason want someone to find an item before they figure out a little detail, you know, microstories are a really good way to go. As I said, like, microstories are flexible. They can be, you know, audio format. Again, going back to, BioShock, they have those little audio clips that you can find around. That again, like, all of them add to this story and to the depth of the game world. Questions? Or no questions, that's fine too. Okay.
Where do you see the line between like adding enough extra content or microstories and or enough storytelling that it's fun, as opposed to it's
drowning
just too much content?
So I always think of them as being optional things for the player to engage in. And I guess the line of too much is when you're like forcing them onto the player. If you're being like, hey, you have to go look at like this item here, like, look, it's so cool, isn't it neat? It's like, it's this added too much, don't do it. You know, it's, it's up to the player to decide how much they want to engage in the game world and how much they don't want to engage, because there are definitely players out there who are like, skip all the dialogue, I don't care, I just want to like go kill somebody. And then there are players out there who are like, I have to explore every single corner, and this is me, every single corner before I can move on from this area. I want to know everything, you know, and so you have to sort of find this balance of like, you know, there are definitely things to find if you want to look, but if you don't want to look, fine, it's not in your way. Anyone else? Yeah.
I like your backgrounds. It's not a question, sorry.
Thank you. That was one of my mock-ups from one of my game jam games.
Also, not a question.
Okay. Comment section,
no,
sorry.
This talk's really making me want to play Metroid Prime again. I have to pick that up. That 1 minute did pretty good.
It's actually not a game that I've played, but is absolutely on the list to play. So.
You gotta check it out. There's this one, it's not really a spoiler, where the space pirates are trying to replicate Samus's like morph ball ability. Because that's like the one thing they can't, like, they figure out all the weapons and everything, but that's it. And they're just like documenting all these like space pirates that they just kill trying to morph them into balls.
Yeah, that's cool. That's really good. Yeah.
What would you categorize something like Resident Evil 1, where you know things are going on, but you have I guess the micro stories of all that, the diary entries of all the other people and stuff like that?
So again, I have not played Resident Evil 1. Talking from some of the more recent Resident Evil games I've seen, so I have not played myself, but I've seen very thorough Let's Playthroughs of Resident Evil 7 and the remake of 2. Yeah, I mean, I definitely, like, the details that they have in those games are fascinating to me, and that's like what makes me want to actually go and play them at some point on my own. Yeah, I mean, so a lot of the times microstories and environmental storytelling are used not just to like add details that you wouldn't otherwise know, but that's a great use for them, but to like really highlight or reinforce what you have learned through the main story. So, you know, obviously Resident Evil, you're dealing with some kind of like, I mean, you figure out later that people are making these forgive the ignorance.
They're zombies.
Yeah.
It's a weapon.
Yeah, it's, well, an Umbrella Corp, right? Or am I mixing?
Yeah, you're right.
Okay. Yeah, so, you know, obviously you find out about that later, but like right from the start of the game, you know that these creatures are there, you know that they're bad, and like you know that everything's going on, but like, yeah, like you can definitely find a lot of details throughout the game to like, you know, that really back up what's being fed to you through the main story, if that made any sense. Anybody else?
I think I'm also reminded of one of my favorite examples of environmental storytelling in real life is, there's two of them. One of them, there's a liquor store near my house where one day there was just suddenly a sign that said like, please don't bring your pets inside the building.
Yep.
And just knowing that, there's got to be something. I tried grilling some of the corpse and what happened. Apparently they weren't the ones that were there, but I had to know what kind of pet this was.
Yeah, that's one of my favorite things in the world, like seeing like rules for something and you're like, there's a story behind this one. What happened? And
there's a gas station where suddenly there was like a sign on every one of the pumps that said, be sure to remove it from your car before leaving. It's like, oh god, this happened.
Yep. Yeah, that's great. Yeah, that mean, because there are definitely so many times where you walk somewhere and you see something and you're like, oh, you know, X, Y, and Z happened here. Like one of the pictures I decided not to put on my slideshow was there's like this street sign called Hoarding Town, and then under it there's this little plaque called Stop Stealing the Street Sign. So, yeah, that's pretty good. Anybody else? Yep.
What, so there's not a lot of games that do books much anymore or whatnot, but how would you go and you give like, a backstory, like in the actual like book that you would get in the game, or even on the back of something, just to tell like detail about stuff without giving away the farm of showing?
Yeah. So at least personally, again, without like flooding somebody with too much information right off the bat, and then the other thing is when you're discovering a story, it's fun to find little pieces of it at a time. You know, if you're going, say, for like a backstory of a character or like maybe the history of the world that the game is in, giving like a few of like the broader strokes of the story, the few like, you know, interesting bits about the main points on the back cover or like in the little booklet, but then also having more stuff in the game that expands far beyond that is a cool way of doing it, because you can have somebody who like looks at that information on the box and reads it and is like, oh, this is interesting, and then as they play they like find out, oh, here's this other detail relating to it, you know, here's this information about, you know, whatever. So yeah.
There's actually, I was going to say, that reminded me, there's a really good example of that with if you bought the original physical copy of Half-Life when it came out, in the manual on the first page, the main character, Gordon Freeman, the game starts on his first day. So the first page of the manual is actually a job acceptance letter that tells just a little bit about like what he's going to be tasked with and stuff. And it has absolutely nothing to do with like what you actually need to know for the game. But if you took the time to read through it, it kind of gives you a little more backstory on what's happening.
Yeah, well, and it lets you sort of, as the player, inhabit the character better, because you know like where their mindset is going into the events they get into. Yeah.
Is he like the guy who opens all the barrels in the factory?
Anything else? Yes, Dylan?
So what are you working on now?
So much. I'm working on, as I said, another text adventure where you're on a spaceship, and apparently I have an obsession with people going insane. Your air filter basically breaks, and you have to repair it before everyone on the ship goes crazy. So, and then there's going to be, I think, in total 3 NPCs you can talk to, and like as you go further through the game, they get like more and more like just off, and like, you know, by the end of it, like if you try to talk to them, they just don't know what's going on. Like they're talking about stuff that you have like no idea about. But what's really fun about that is like I can kind of craft their personalities through it. Like so, you know, the captain, when he starts going crazy, like becomes like way more talkative than he ever was in the beginning. So that's a ton of fun. I'm also working on, if anybody remembers, I made a tiny game for my cousin last year, 2 years ago, I don't remember. And I'm expanding that into a much larger game that's a mystery. And because when Lydia and I started writing when we were very little, we always wrote mystery stories together. So now we're making a mystery game together. So those are really the 2 main game projects, and then balancing that with multiple writing projects is great.
What are you making with that?
Which one?
Both?
Oh, okay.
Yes.
So yes, the text adventure, I'm not actually using an engine for. I'm literally just, you know, making my own JavaScript and HTML files. So pretty much the same as what I did for Treasure of Drift Cave. And then the mystery that I'm doing for Lydia, the original game I made with Bitsy, but I think with the stuff that I want to do for this version of it is going to be far beyond what Bitsy can actually handle. So I'm keeping the same art style and the same like 8-bit tiles, but I'm going to move it over to Game Maker. So